The moment the courtroom started laughing was the moment everything began to go wrong. On a gray Tuesday morning in downtown Chicago, courtroom 4B was already crowded before the hearing even began. Attorneys shuffled through thick folders, reporters whispered to one another near the back row, and spectators filled nearly every available seat. Most of them had come expecting a routine case. None of them expected to remember this day for the rest of their lives. Then the side door opened, and a woman stepped inside. She looked completely ordinary. Her Navy maintenance uniform was neatly pressed, though clearly worn from years of use. A janitor's badge hung from a lanyard around her neck. She carried no expensive briefcase. No legal team followed behind her. No one stood when she entered. In fact, a few people exchanged amused glances the moment they realized who she was. Her name was Margaret Ellis, and according to nearly everyone in that room, she didn't belong there. The judge barely looked up as she took her seat. The prosecuting attorney glanced toward her table and then quickly returned to his paperwork, as though she was little more than a formality standing between him and an easy victory. Even some members of the audience seemed confused about why a courthouse janitor had somehow become the center of a legal proceeding. Yet Margaret appeared strangely calm. Not nervous, not defensive, just quiet. And somehow that quietness felt out of place. Because people facing public embarrassment usually show something. Fear, frustration, anxiety. But Margaret simply folded her hands and waited. The hearing had not even started, and already there was a strange imbalance in the room. Everyone seemed certain they understood exactly who she was. The problem was that none of them actually did. As the clerk prepared the docket and the attorneys organized their documents, a few spectators continued whispering among themselves. Some smiled. Others shook their heads. The assumptions came easily. A janitor, a maintenance worker, someone with no authority, no influence, no reason to challenge the people sitting across from her. The judge finally adjusted his glasses and called the room to order. Conversation stopped. Chairs settled. The atmosphere became formal once again. Yet as silence filled the courtroom, something unusual happened. Margaret looked toward the bench with the same steady expression she had carried since entering the room. She did not look intimidated. She did not look impressed. If anything, she looked like someone observing a process she already understood. The detail was subtle. Most people missed it completely. But one court reporter sitting near the front noticed it immediately. There was no uncertainty in her eyes. And that was odd, because according to the official records available to the public, Margaret Ellis was almost invisible. No advanced degrees. No public achievements. No history that explained such confidence. The file attached to her name was surprisingly thin. Too thin. Almost as if entire chapters of her life had vanished. And that was the first detail that should have made everyone pay attention. Because while the courtroom believed they were looking at a janitor with no power, there was one question no one had stopped to ask. Why did a woman with almost no documented past seem completely unafraid of everything that was about to happen? The prosecutor wasted no time. The moment the preliminary formalities ended, he rose from his chair with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. His suit was immaculate, his voice steady, and every movement suggested complete control. He placed a thick stack of documents on the table before him and began presenting the case. To anyone listening, the story sounded simple. According to the records, Margaret Ellis had overstepped responsibilities that were never hers. Procedures had allegedly been ignored. Internal reports appeared to support the claims. Timelines seemed consistent. Statements appeared aligned. Piece after piece fit together so neatly that even some spectators began nodding before he finished speaking. The narrative was clean. Too clean. Yet nobody questioned it. Why would they? Most people trust confidence when they see it. They assume certainty must come from truth. And at that moment, the prosecutor appeared. Certain about everything. As he continued speaking, he occasionally glanced toward Margaret, almost as if expecting a reaction. A protest. An interruption. Some visible sign of pressure. But none came. She remained exactly as she had been since entering the courtroom. Quiet. Attentive. Patient. The contrast became increasingly noticeable. The more aggressively the case was presented, the calmer she appeared. Even Judge Harrison seemed to notice. His expression remained professional, but his eyes drifted toward Margaret more often than before. Not because she was doing anything unusual, because she was not. Most people placed under public scrutiny instinctively try to defend themselves. They shake their heads, whisper to attorneys, review notes, search for reassurance. Margaret did none of those things. She simply listened. The prosecutor eventually reached what appeared to be his strongest point. He referenced a sequence of official filings and supporting documentation. According to the timeline he presented, the facts were undeniable. Several members of the audience exchanged knowing looks. A woman in the second row quietly folded her arms as if the matter had already been settled. Even the court reporter seemed to anticipate a routine conclusion. Then something subtle happened. Margaret lowered her eyes toward the documents in front of her. Not nervously, not urgently. She simply glanced at a single page resting near the top of a thin folder. One page, nothing more. Yet for a brief moment, the faintest hint of curiosity appeared on her face. It was not concern. It was not surprise. If anything, it looked like recognition, as though she had just confirmed something she already suspected. The expression disappeared almost immediately. Nobody seemed to notice except an older man seated near the back of the courtroom. He had been watching quietly since the hearing began. Now he leaned forward slightly, because the look he had just seen was not the expression of someone losing. It was the expression of someone waiting. Meanwhile, the prosecutor continued building momentum. Every statement reinforced the previous one. Every document appeared to strengthen the case. By the time he finally finished speaking, the room felt heavier. More certain, more convinced. Judge Harrison adjusted the papers before him and prepared to continue. From every outward appearance, Margaret Ellis stood completely alone. A courthouse janitor facing a system that already seemed to know exactly what it believed. Yet beneath that certainty, hidden so deeply that almost nobody could see it, a small question had begun to emerge. If the evidence was truly as clear as everyone claimed, why had Margaret never looked worried even once? And more importantly, why did it seem as though she had been waiting for this exact presentation all along? The silence that followed the prosecutor's presentation felt almost ceremonial. From every visible angle, the case appeared complete. Judge Harrison glanced down at the documents spread across his bench, then toward Margaret. For the first time that morning, he addressed her directly. "Ms. Ellis, do you wish to respond?" Several people in the gallery shifted in their seats. Some looked curious. Others looked entertained. The expectation was obvious. They expected a denial. They expected excuses. They expected someone cornered by circumstances. What they did not expect was what happened next. Margaret slowly stood, straightened a single sheet of paper in front of her, and looked toward the judge. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm enough that a few people leaned forward just to hear it. "Your Honor, before I respond to the allegations, may I ask a question regarding the timeline that was just presented?" The request sounded so simple that nobody immediately understood its significance. The prosecutor certainly did not. In fact, he appeared almost relieved. A question about the timeline seemed harmless compared to challenging the evidence itself. Judge Harrison nodded. "Proceed." Margaret looked briefly toward the stack of exhibits on the prosecutor's table. "Can you clarify why Exhibit 7 references a report submitted at 3:42 p.m. when the supporting authorization document is timestamped at 4:18 p.m.? The courtroom became still. Not dramatically. Not instantly. Just enough for people to notice. The prosecutor blinked once, then twice. He glanced down at his papers. It was a small reaction, but it was the first crack anyone had seen all morning. "The difference is administrative," he replied quickly. "The exact timing is not relevant to the matter before the court." Margaret nodded politely. "Perhaps." Then she fell silent. That was it. No argument. No accusation. No attempt to prove him wrong. She simply sat back down. The exchange lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet something strange happened afterward. The certainty that had filled the room no longer felt quite as solid. Because once a question exists, people begin looking for answers. Judge Harrison's eyes returned to the documents. He turned a page, then another. Meanwhile, the prosecutor resumed speaking, but the rhythm had changed. Before, he sounded like a man delivering conclusions. Now he sounded like a man protecting them. The difference was subtle but unmistakable. In the audience, whispers began appearing in isolated corners of the room. Nothing disruptive, just curiosity. The older man seated near the back who had been watching Margaret since the beginning narrowed his eyes. He seemed less interested in the timeline discrepancy than in something else entirely. Margaret herself. Because her question had revealed something unexpected. She had not challenged the facts. She had challenged the structure supporting them. And that required a very different kind of understanding. The more he thought about it, the less sense her official background made. A courthouse janitor should not have spotted that detail within seconds. Yet she had. And judging by the calm expression on her face, she had known exactly where to look. Then, as Judge Harrison reviewed another page, his hands suddenly stopped moving. His eyes remained fixed on a single line longer than before. Nobody knew it yet, but the first question had already done its work. And somewhere beneath the growing uncertainty, a much larger mystery was beginning to emerge. How could a woman with almost no documented past read legal records like someone who had spent years studying them? Judge Harrison continued studying the page that had interrupted his attention. At first, nobody understood why the room suddenly felt different. The prosecutor was still standing. The exhibits remained unchanged. The official record had not been challenged. Yet something invisible had shifted. It was the kind of shift that happens when certainty encounters its first real obstacle. The judge slowly turned another page. Then another. His movements were unhurried, but they carried a weight that had not been there earlier. Across the courtroom, the prosecutor adjusted his posture and attempted to resume control of the discussion. He referenced additional documentation, repeated several conclusions, and emphasized the consistency of the evidence. His words sounded reasonable. They sounded professional, but they no longer landed with the same force. Because everyone knew what had happened. A single question had forced the room to look closer. Margaret remained seated, her hands folded neatly before her. She did not appear pleased. She did not appear anxious. If anything, she seemed detached from the growing tension around her. That calmness was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Most people would have treated the moment as a victory. Most people would have pushed harder. Yet Margaret did nothing. She simply waited. The older man in the back row noticed it again. Every time attention shifted toward her, she seemed less interested in defending herself than in observing how others responded. It was almost as if she already knew where the conversation would eventually lead. Judge Harrison finally looked up from the documents. "Counselor," he said, directing his attention toward the prosecutor. "Can you clarify the authorization sequence referenced in Exhibit 7? The question was polite, professional, ordinary on the surface, yet the effect was immediate. For the first time that morning, the prosecutor hesitated. Only for a second. Most people would not have noticed. But hesitation has a way of revealing itself once confidence begins to crack. "The sequence follows standard administrative procedures," he replied. "The discrepancy does not affect the substance of the record." Judge Harrison nodded slowly. Then he glanced back, down at the paperwork. The silence that followed stretched slightly longer than anyone expected. In the audience, curiosity began replacing certainty. Spectators who had arrived expecting a straightforward hearing now found themselves paying closer attention. Even the court reporter seemed more focused than before. Something about the situation no longer felt simple. Then Margaret spoke again. Her voice was as calm as ever. "Your Honor, may I ask one additional question?" The prosecutor immediately turned toward her. This time the reaction was impossible to miss. He was listening very carefully now. Judge Harrison granted permission. Margaret looked directly at the exhibit in question. If the authorization sequence was standard, why does the supplemental filing reference information that had not yet been approved at the time it was submitted? The room went completely silent. Not because anyone understood the answer. Because nobody had considered the possibility that such a question existed. Judge Harrison's eyes returned to the documents immediately. The prosecutor opened his folder and began searching through several pages. Somewhere in the gallery, a spectator quietly lowered a notebook and stared toward the front of the room. The first discrepancy had seemed small. This one felt different, because it suggested a pattern. And as Judge Harrison reviewed the record once again, a thought began forming in the minds of everyone watching. If Margaret had found two inconsistencies within minutes, what else had everyone overlooked? The prosecutor finally found the page he had been searching for and placed it on the table with visible relief. "Your Honor, the supplemental filing is explained by a routine internal review process," he said. "There is nothing unusual about it." For a moment, it seemed as though the momentum might return to his side. Several spectators nodded again. The explanation sounded reasonable. It sounded official. Judge Harrison accepted the document and began reviewing it carefully. Margaret remained silent. She did not interrupt. She did not challenge the explanation. Instead, she reached into the thin folder that had been sitting in front of her since the beginning of the hearing. The movement was so ordinary that almost nobody paid attention. Then she removed a single document. One page. No thick binder. No stack of evidence. Just one page. She waited patiently until the judge finished reviewing the prosecutor's submission. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "may I provide a related document for context?" The request immediately drew attention. Judge Harrison hesitated briefly before nodding. A court clerk walked forward and accepted the page from Margaret before delivering it to the bench. The prosecutor watched the exchange carefully. Whatever confidence had filled the room earlier was now fading. Not because anyone had proven him wrong, because nobody knew what would happen next. Judge Harrison lowered his eyes to the page. At first, his expression did not change. Then he read a second line, then a third. The room became noticeably quieter. Even the soft sounds of paper movement seemed louder than before. The judge read the document again, this time more slowly. The prosecutor shifted his weight slightly. It was a small movement, but it carried the unmistakable weight of uncertainty. Finally, Judge Harrison looked up. "Where did you obtain this document?" he asked. It was the first question directed toward Margaret that carried genuine curiosity rather than procedure. Margaret answered without hesitation. It was included in the courthouse archive records. A ripple moved through the spectators. Archive records. The phrase sounded simple, yet it immediately raised another question. Why would a courthouse janitor be reviewing archive records in the first place? Judge Harrison looked back down at the page. This filing appears to reference the same matter several weeks before the timeline presented today. The statement landed heavily, not because it resolved anything, because it complicated everything. The prosecutor immediately stepped forward. "Your Honor, that document is preliminary and does not represent a final determination." The response came faster than his earlier answers. Faster than normal. Judge Harrison nodded, but did not take his eyes off the page. Margaret remained seated, still calm, still patient. Then she spoke again. "That may be true. However, if the issue was already acknowledged weeks earlier, why was it later presented as newly discovered information?" Nobody answered immediately. The question lingered in the air. It was no longer about a timestamp. It was no longer about a sequence number. For the first time, the courtroom was looking at a pattern instead of an isolated discrepancy. Several audience members exchanged confused glances. Others began quietly reviewing notes they had taken earlier. The older man in the back row leaned forward even farther, because something far more interesting than the hearing itself was beginning to emerge. Margaret had not produced a random document. She had produced exactly the document needed to connect multiple inconsistencies together. And that realization led to a question nobody could ignore. If she knew where to find this record, what else did she know that had not yet been revealed? The atmosphere inside courtroom 4B had changed so gradually that most people could not identify the exact moment it happened. Yet everyone could feel it. Earlier that morning, the audience had watched Margaret Ellis with quiet skepticism. Now they watched her with something very different. Attention. Judge Harrison remained focused on the documents spread before him. What had begun as a routine review of evidence had evolved into a careful examination of connections. One discrepancy could be dismissed. Two might be explained. But multiple inconsistencies linked together created a problem that could not be ignored. The prosecutor understood this. His confidence had not disappeared entirely, but it was no longer driving the room. Now it was chasing events instead of controlling them. He continued offering explanations, each one professionally stated and legally reasonable. Yet every answer seemed to create another question. Every clarification appeared to expose another gap. Margaret, meanwhile, remained remarkably still. She was not acting like someone trying to win an argument. She was acting like someone assembling a puzzle piece by piece. Judge Harrison finally placed one document beside another and compared them. Carefully, the silence stretched longer than before. Then he looked toward the prosecutor. These records appear to reference the same issue through different reporting pathways. Why was that distinction not disclosed in the original presentation? No one reacted immediately. The question itself was enough. Several spectators exchanged glances. The court reporter paused briefly before continuing her notes. The prosecutor answered as carefully as possible, explaining procedural classifications and administrative distinctions. His explanation was technically sound, yet something unexpected happened. Before anyone could move forward, Margaret quietly spoke again. "Your Honor, may I direct attention to the attachment referenced in the secondary filing?" The prosecutor turned toward her almost instantly. That reaction alone drew attention. Earlier, he had treated her comments as minor interruptions. Now he listened to every word. Judge Harrison nodded. Margaret did not produce another document. Instead, she referenced a page already sitting among the court exhibits. The judge located it and began reading. A few seconds passed. Then his eyes narrowed slightly. It was the first visible sign of concentration anyone had seen from him all morning. The attachment contained a summary prepared weeks before the events described in the official timeline. More importantly, it referenced concerns that were nearly identical to those later presented as newly identified discoveries. The audience could not see every detail, but they could see the judge's reaction. And that was enough. The balance inside the room continued shifting. A woman who had spent most of the hearing taking notes now stopped writing entirely. Two spectators who had quietly supported the prosecutor's position earlier now seemed uncertain. Even the older man in the back row looked less interested in the case itself than in Margaret, because a new mystery had emerged. It was no longer simply about the records. It was about her. How had she connected documents scattered across different filing systems? How had she identified relationships that experienced professionals appeared to overlook? Judge Harrison eventually leaned back and folded his hands. His attention settled on Margaret for several seconds. Not with suspicion, not with criticism, with genuine curiosity. "Ms. Ellis," he said carefully, "how did you know where to find these records?" For the first time that day, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, because everyone suddenly realized they had been asking the wrong question from the beginning. The mystery was no longer hidden inside the documents. The mystery was sitting quietly at the defense table. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Judge Harrison's question seemed to hang over the courtroom like a weight. How did she know where to find the records? It was the first question that had nothing to do with evidence, filings, or procedure. It was a question about Margaret herself. She remained seated, her expression unchanged. Then she answered, "Because I spent years organizing them." A few people exchanged confused looks. The answer sounded ordinary at first, almost disappointing. But Judge Harrison continued watching her carefully. He sensed there was more. "Organizing records is not the same as understanding them," he said. Margaret nodded slightly. "That is true, Your Honor." The silence returned. Then, for the first time that day, she volunteered information no one had requested. "Before I worked in maintenance, I worked in records management." The statement immediately captured the room's attention. The prosecutor frowned. Several spectators leaned forward. Records management explained some things. It explained familiarity with filing systems. It explained access to archives. But it did not explain everything. Not even close. Judge Harrison seemed to reach the same conclusion. "For how long?" he asked. "Nearly 20 years. This time the reaction was visible. People who had spent the morning viewing Margaret as an ordinary janitor suddenly found themselves reconsidering everything they thought they knew. 20 years. 2 decades spent inside systems built around documentation, procedure, and record preservation. Suddenly her observations felt less surprising. Yet something still did not fit. The older man in the back row understood it. Immediately, 20 years of records experience explained how she found the documents. It did not explain how she interpreted them so quickly. That required something more. Judge Harrison appeared to arrive at the same realization. "You seem unusually familiar with procedural review." Margaret hesitated briefly, not because she was uncertain, because she appeared to be deciding how much to say. Then she spoke. "Earlier in my career, I assisted with compliance audits." The room became completely silent. The prosecutor's expression changed instantly. It was subtle, but impossible to miss. For the first time all morning, he looked genuinely concerned. Compliance audits. The phrase carried weight. It meant identifying inconsistencies. It meant examining timelines. It meant connecting records from multiple sources. Suddenly, every question Margaret had asked made perfect sense. Yet at the same time, the revelation created a much larger mystery. If she possessed that level of experience, why was she working as a courthouse janitor? The question spread through the room without anyone speaking it aloud. Judge Harrison studied her carefully. "You never mentioned any of this earlier." Margaret offered a small smile. Not proud, not defensive, simply honest. No one asked. The answer landed harder than any argument she could have made, because it forced everyone to confront an uncomfortable truth. From the moment she entered the courtroom, people had decided who she was. They saw a uniform and stopped looking deeper. They saw a job title and assumed it explained everything. Nobody had been interested in her story. Nobody had considered the possibility that her past extended far beyond the role they could see. Yet even now, something remained hidden. Because compliance auditing explained her skill, it explained her observations. But it did not explain the thin file attached to her name. It did not explain why so much of her professional history seemed to have disappeared. And as Judge Harrison looked down at the documents one more time, a new question began forming. If Margaret Ellis had revealed this much already, what part of her past was she still not telling them? The question lingered long after Margaret stopped speaking. Nobody in the courtroom seemed interested in the original allegations anymore. The focus had shifted completely. Earlier that morning, people wanted to know whether she had made mistakes. Now they wanted to know who she really was. Judge Harrison studied her for several moments before speaking again. Your employment record indicates maintenance work for the past 8 years, he said. What happened before that? The room became perfectly still. Even the prosecutor appeared interested in the answer. Margaret looked down briefly at the documents in front of her. When she finally spoke, her voice remained calm, but there was something different in it now. Something heavier. I retired from compliance work after an internal review uncovered problems that certain people preferred to keep hidden. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. For the first time, the courtroom was not listening because it had to. It was listening because it wanted to. Margaret continued. The findings were eventually confirmed, but the process changed how I viewed professional success. Afterward, I chose a quieter life. Several spectators exchanged glances. The explanation answered part of the mystery, yet it somehow made the situation even more intriguing. A woman who once conducted compliance reviews had voluntarily stepped away from that career and spent years working behind the scenes in the very courthouse where she now sat. Judge Harrison folded his hands together. And during those years, you continued reviewing records? Margaret nodded. Not officially. A faint smile crossed her face. But when you spend enough years around archives, you learn that records tell stories people sometimes forget. The statement settled across the room like a weight, because everyone understood what she meant. Documents preserve details. Timelines preserve truth. And truth did not care about titles, uniforms, or assumptions. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. He had spent the entire morning building a case based on appearances and procedure. Margaret had spent the same morning quietly dismantling those appearances one fact at a time. Then Judge Harrison looked back toward the exhibits. There is still one thing I do not understand, he said. If you recognize these discrepancies so quickly, why did you wait until today to raise them? For the first time, Margaret paused longer than usual. The answer clearly mattered. When she finally spoke, her words were measured. Because nobody asked me to explain. They only asked me to respond. The silence that followed was unlike any silence earlier in the hearing. It was not uncertainty. It was realization. Several people lowered their eyes. Others stared toward the defense table. The meaning behind her answer was impossible to miss. From the moment she entered the room, everyone had assumed they already understood her. Nobody had been interested in what she knew. Nobody had asked what experience she carried. They saw a janitor and filled in the rest of the story themselves. Judge Harrison slowly leaned back in his chair. Even he seemed affected by the realization. Then Margaret spoke once more. Her voice was quiet, but every person in the room heard it clearly. People often believe the uniform explains the person wearing it. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it hides everything important. No one responded. Not the prosecutor. Not the spectators. Not even the judge. Because in that moment, the courtroom understood something uncomfortable. The documents had revealed flaws in the case. But Margaret's words had revealed something far more difficult to confront. How many conclusions had been reached long before anyone bothered to learn the truth? No one spoke for several seconds after Margaret's final words. The silence felt different now. Earlier, it had been the silence of doubt. Now it was the silence that follows a realization nobody expected to have. Judge Harrison slowly looked across the courtroom. The documents before him no longer supported the certainty that had existed at the start of the hearing. The timeline contained questions. The records contained contradictions, and the woman everyone had underestimated had been the one person willing to point them out. The prosecutor remained standing, but the confidence that had defined his presentation was gone. He knew it. The spectators knew it. Even the reporters seated along the side wall seemed more interested in Margaret than in the official proceedings. Judge Harrison reviewed the evidence one final time. Then he closed the folder in front of him. The sound echoed softly through the room. Based on the inconsistencies identified during this hearing, he said, the court cannot rely upon the current presentation of the record without further review. A wave of quiet movement spread through the audience. Nobody cheered. Nobody celebrated. The moment felt too significant for that. Margaret did not react either. She simply listened. The judge continued. Additional examination would be required. Certain findings would need verification. Several assumptions that had shaped the case could no longer be treated as established facts. It was not a dramatic declaration. It was something far more powerful. It was an acknowledgement that the truth mattered more than appearances. When Judge Harrison finished speaking, he looked directly at Margaret. His expression carried none of the distance that had been there earlier that morning. Ms. Ellis, he said, the court appreciates your observations. The statement was brief, yet everyone understood what it meant. Hours earlier, many people in that room had viewed her as someone whose voice barely mattered. Now the highest authority in the courtroom was publicly recognizing her contribution. Margaret nodded politely. Nothing more. No victory speech. No display of satisfaction. Just quiet dignity. The older man seated in the back row smiled for the first time all day. He had been watching the transformation unfold from the beginning. Not the transformation of the case. The transformation of the room. People who had once looked past Margaret were now looking directly at her. People who assumed they understood her were realizing how little they actually knew. As spectators began gathering their belongings, conversations quietly emerged throughout the courtroom. Yet the discussion was not about filings or procedures. It was about her. About how easily assumptions had shaped perception. About how quickly confidence can collapse when it is built on incomplete understanding. Margaret collected her folder and stood. The same maintenance uniform. The same calm expression. The same woman who had walked into the courtroom that morning. Yet somehow everything felt different. Because the room had changed, not her. As she approached the exit, a young reporter finally asked the question many people were thinking. Do you have any comment about today's outcome? Margaret paused near the doorway. Then she offered a small smile. People deserve to be heard before they are judged. That was all she said. Then she walked away. And long after the courtroom emptied, long after the documents were packed away and the conversations ended, those words remained. Because the most important lesson from that day was never hidden inside a file, a timeline, or a legal record. It was hidden inside a mistake almost everyone had made. They saw a job title and assumed they knew a person. They saw a uniform and stopped asking questions. And in doing so, they nearly overlooked the one person who understood the truth better than anyone else in the room.